Have you ever stopped to think about who your neighbor is? Maybe it's not who you think it is. In today's world, where we are surrounded by indifference and apathy, the parable of the Good Samaritan still speaks deeply about how we should live. But are we really understanding what it means to love our neighbor in a practical way? In today's video, we'll explore this timeless story and reflect on the impact it can have on your life today. What does the Good Samaritan teach us? How should we behave towards the people we meet in our lives? Are we doing the right thing, or are we ignoring those around us simply because they don't fit into our circle? Get ready, because today we're going to find out, in a practical way, who your neighbor is and what you can do to be a true Samaritan today. And before you follow, subscribe to the channel and leave your like if you believe that the message of loving your neighbor can transform the world. Don't miss the rest of this video, because today's reflection could change the way you see others around you. Have you ever wondered who your neighbor is? In an increasingly individualistic world, we seem to have forgotten the true meaning of loving our neighbor. But perhaps it's not the person with whom you have ties of friendship or kinship. Your neighbor could be someone completely different, someone you would never have imagined. Ultimately, the real question is not who your neighbor is, but who you choose to be for others. Today, we're going to explore one of the most powerful parables Jesus told, that of the Good Samaritan, a story that, at first glance, may seem simple, but which carries profound lessons about compassion, mutual aid, and the limits of Christian love. The question is, are we really doing what Jesus taught us, or are we more focused on our routines, our problems, and ignoring those who perhaps need us the most? The truth is that this parable is not just a tale of kindness, but an invitation to reflect on our attitude towards others, especially in the context of a hurried and often indifferent world. Who would you help if you knew that this person's life depended on your decision? What's more, who do you think Jesus would consider his neighbor today? Today, let's look at this story with fresh eyes and think, are we really loving our neighbor as Jesus teaches us? What does that mean in practice? Let's find out together. To fully understand the depth of the parable of the Good Samaritan, we first need to go back in time and explore the cultural and religious context of Jesus' time. The story of the Good Samaritan was told by Jesus in response to a question posed by a teacher of the law: who is my neighbor? This question was directly linked to an attempt to justify the man's attitudes towards others. At the time of Jesus, the Jews had a very rigid view of who was considered a neighbor. According to the law of Moses, the neighbor was the one who was part of the same people, to whom love and help should be given. In other words, a Jew would consider another Jew his neighbor, but not the Samaritans, who were seen as heretics, descendants of Jews mixed with other peoples during the time of the Assyrian captivity. The Samaritans were descendants of the Israelites who remained in the northern region of Israel after the invasion of the Assyrian Empire in the 700s BC. After the invasion, the Assyrians mixed with the Israelites, and because of this, the Jews who lived in Judah viewed them with contempt, considering them unclean because they had different religious practices and didn't follow all the Jewish traditions. They were therefore seen as strangers and heretics. Jesus then chooses a Samaritan to be the hero of his story, an extremely provocative act. The Samaritan in the parable not only helps the wounded man, but does so in a compassionate way, even though he knows that his people and the wounded man were historical enemies. For the listeners of the time, this was a radical story. In telling it, Jesus was challenging social and religious conventions, asking his listeners to expand their view of love of neighbor. The neighbor in the parable is not simply someone who is close to you or who has the same faith as you. The neighbor is any human being in need, regardless of race, religion, or social position. Jesus was redefining the concept of love of neighbor, extending it to everyone who needs help, without barriers or prejudice. By understanding this context, we can begin to apply the story to our daily lives. When Jesus talks about loving our neighbor, he's not talking about a superficial kindness or a love restricted to our social circle or those we get along with. He invites us to look at everyone around us, including those with whom we have little or no affinity, and see in them the image of God. Now, scripture keepers, think for a moment. Who are the Samaritans in your life? The ones you might least expect to help. If you've ever thought of someone like that, let us know in the comments who you consider to be the stranger or enemy who needs your help. And of course, Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to follow more reflections like this. The story of the Good Samaritan begins with a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. This road was known to be dangerous, a barren and rocky terrain, prone to ambushes by bandits. The man is attacked, beaten, and left almost dead by the side of the road. Now imagine the scenario. He is wounded, bereft of any resources, with no strength to move. He depends on someone to help him, but life has placed him at a point of extreme vulnerability. As he didn't know, help could come from anywhere, but who would care? First, a priest appears. He sees the man, but instead of approaching him, he simply passes by, ignoring his pain and need. His attitude was a reflection of how we often distance ourselves from the suffering of others, even when we have the ability to help. The priest, someone who should be the embodiment of compassion and care, simply ignores him. It's possible that the priest thought he shouldn't get involved, that the risk of becoming unclean or being delayed on his journey was greater than the pain of that fallen man. Then a Levite passes by, an equally religious figure, someone with spiritual responsibilities, but again, the result is the same. He too sees the wounded man, but doesn't offer his help. Perhaps he thought that, for reasons of purity or social rules, he couldn't get involved with such a dirty and defenseless man. But then something surprising happens. A Samaritan, a man from a people hated by the Jews, a stranger to the story's listeners, sees the wounded man. And here's the big turning point. The Samaritan not only approaches him, but takes pity on him, and his action goes far beyond simple goodwill. He takes care of the man's wounds, putting oil and wine on them, and puts him on his own horse. The Samaritan then takes him to an inn, where he pays for his care, telling the innkeeper that if there are any more expenses, he will pay them on his return. Note the difference between the three characters. The priest and the Levite look at the man and continue on their way, without any concrete action. But the Samaritan, even though he is a historical enemy, not only sees the need, he acts. He doesn't care what it looks like or how much it costs to help. His compassion overcomes any barrier. Here, Jesus teaches us something powerful. Love is not about titles or social status, but about action and compassion. True love is practical and involves sacrifice. It is not conditional on who you are or what you believe, but on what you are willing to do for the other, regardless of differences. Now, Scripture keepers, as we reflect on this story, think, who in your life can you help today in a practical way and without expecting anything in return? Sometimes the greatest gesture of love doesn't require great actions, but the willingness to help those around us without hesitation. Let us know in the comments a recent situation where you had the opportunity to be a Samaritan for someone. And of course, if you haven't signed up yet, do so now to follow more teachings like this one. Love of neighbor begins with our attitude. The parable of the Good Samaritan is not just an old story, but a timeless message, full of profound lessons for our lives today. Every detail of the story can be seen as an invitation for us to reflect on the way we act towards others, especially in difficult and challenging times. One of the clearest lessons of this parable is about active compassion. The Samaritan didn't just see the wounded man and lament his condition, he acted. And here is the crucial point. Christian love is not passive, it demands action. True compassion is not content with mere feelings of pity or empathy, but translates into concrete actions of care and sacrifice. In a world so divided and full of barriers, where individualism often predominates, we are challenged to see everyone around us as close, regardless of their religion, race, social status, or even beliefs. Who is your neighbor today? Who have you ignored or avoided, whether out of prejudice, fear, or indifference? Jesus invites us to break down these barriers and act in favor of others. Let's also think about the attitude of the priest and the Levite. They were men of faith, with religious authority, but they failed to act. The fact that we are people of faith does not exempt us from the responsibility to act on behalf of others. Sometimes we can be quick to fulfill our religious rituals and preach what is right, but are we really practicing love? Are we actively living the gospel in our daily lives? Or are we just walking alongside pain and need, like the priest and a Levite? An important reflection here is that love of neighbor should not be conditional on who the person is or how much they deserve to be helped. The Samaritan didn't calculate or question the value of his action. He simply saw a need and did what he could to meet it. Jesus calls us to practice unconditional love, which doesn't look at the circumstances, but at the human being in front of us. As Scripture keepers, the real mission is to go beyond discourse and get involved with the suffering of the world. It's not enough to know that love of neighbor is Jesus' command. You have to live it. And this can manifest itself in simple ways, such as helping a neighbor, listening to someone who's going through a difficult time, or even taking a stand against injustices that happen around us. So, guardians, the question that remains is, what is your attitude towards the needs of others? How can you act in a practical and merciful way in your life today? Remember, every little act of kindness reflects Christ's love in the world. Leave a comment sharing an experience where you were or could be a Good Samaritan. How can you, in concrete actions, live this love in your daily life? And if you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe and leave your like so that more people can join us in this mission to spread Christian love. The parable of the Good Samaritan is full of layers of meaning and over the centuries has generated various interpretations and even controversial discussions. One of the most interesting questions relates to the historical and cultural context of Jesus' time, especially the fact that the Samaritans were seen as enemies by the Jews. At the time of Jesus, Jews and Samaritans not only didn't speak to each other, but there was a deep historical hatred between these two groups. The Samaritans were descendants of Jews who had mixed with other nations and practiced a different form of worship, which the Jews considered heretical. So, by choosing a Samaritan as the hero of the story, Jesus was challenging the racial and religious barriers of the time. Not only did he show that love of neighbor must transcend human divisions, but he also overturned expectations of who was righteous and who was sinful. For the Jew of the time, the priest and the Levite would be the figures most worthy of compassion, but Jesus inverts this expectation and places a Samaritan as the model of mercy. This is very provocative. Today, we still see deep divisions between social, religious, political, and racial groups. Who are the Samaritans in our society? Who are the people or groups that we somehow consider inferior or unclean? The parable challenges us to see our neighbor as every human being, no matter their origin or belief. But are we ready to break down our own barriers and prejudices? Another curious point in this story is the concept of mercy. The word mercy comes from the Latin misericordia, which means to feel another's pain. This implies not just sympathizing with someone, but getting deeply involved with their pain. The Samaritan didn't see the wounded man and say, "Poor guy, I hope someone helps him," but he approached him, tended to his wounds, and made a personal sacrifice to ensure that the man had what he needed. This is the essence of Christian mercy, acting to alleviate the suffering of others, even when it costs us time, money, or comfort. An interesting curiosity is that in the Christian tradition, Christians are often referred to as Samaritans. This may seem surprising, given that Christians are generally seen as the inheritors of the Jewish faith. However, many theologians and Christian leaders use the term Good Samaritan to symbolize the need to help others, regardless of religion or culture. In a way, Christians are called to be spiritual Samaritans, acting with compassion and mercy, without barriers and without discrimination. So, Scripture keepers, what does this parable tell us about our own attitudes? Who are the Samaritans in our lives? Who are the people who don't fit our standards and who perhaps need our love more than anyone else? Are we willing to be the Good Samaritan in our society, or do we continue to pass by those who need help? Leave your thoughts on this reversal of expectations that Jesus teaches us in the comments. How has this parable challenged your view of love for others? And of course, if you're not yet a Scripture keeper, subscribe to the channel now and enjoy this video. Together, we can spread this message of love and mercy to more people. And so, Scripture keepers, we end our journey through the story of the Good Samaritan. But before we close, one last thought. What does the parable teach us about true love and our mission as Christians? Jesus didn't leave us an easy mission. He calls us to go beyond the simple feeling of compassion, to go beyond the barriers of society and to offer help without expecting anything in return. He challenges us to love our enemies, to care for the marginalized, to get involved with those who need it most, without discrimination, without hesitation. The great lesson of the Good Samaritan is that, in a world that is so divided and selfish, the true Christian must be an instrument of transformation. We cannot be content to live alongside suffering. We are called to act, to make a difference. So, guardians, the question that remains for you is, who is your neighbor today? Who is around you, suffering, waiting for you to approach them, look at them with the eyes of mercy, and do something for them? Who needs your help, your word of comfort, your gesture of generosity? Now is the time to put into practice the love that Jesus taught. Let go of the barriers you've built up, social conventions and prejudices. Open your heart and your hands to those whom God places in your path. Be the Good Samaritan. Be the one who goes the extra mile, who makes a difference, who carries the love of Christ in your heart and in your actions. I want to know about you, guardian. Who in your life is a neighbor that you have avoided or neglected? How can you act to change that? Leave a comment below, sharing your reflections, or even a story of how you've been a Good Samaritan. Together, we can inspire and help each other to live out this calling more fully. If you've been touched by this message and believe it needs to be shared with more people, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with other scripture keepers. The more together we are, the more we can spread Christ's love and transform the world around us. Keep being a scripture keeper. Your mission to live the word makes all the difference. See you in the next video.